Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling a period that really shaped the world.
Yeah.
The Second Wave of Imperialism from 1700 to 1900.
Huge topic.
It is a huge topic. You know, when European powers just expanded their influence all across the globe.
Yeah, all over the place.
And we've got excerpts from some great historical texts here, packed with events and figures and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a feeling we're going to uncover some surprising connections too along the way.
I think what's really interesting about this era is how scientific ideas,
Right.
about like race and evolution, were used to justify domination.
That's a great point to start off with, I think, because,
Yeah.
it's easy to think about imperialism as just like, oh, countries conquering territory.
Right, just like the map changing.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But it's way more complicated than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's all about the ideas.
Yeah, we need to look at the ideas that fueled it. And I think that's a really important part of this.
One of the most unsettling things is the role of scientific racism.
Scientific racism? I mean, that almost sounds like a contradiction in terms.
It really is. But in the late 18th and early 20th centuries, there was this big push to use science to create racial hierarchies.
So how did that actually, play out in real life?
Well, think about phrenology.
Okay.
Remember that? The idea that you could judge a person's intelligence by the shape of their skull.
Oh, yeah, I remember learning about that. It seems so absurd now.
Right.
But I guess people actually believed it back then.
Oh, yeah, they took it super seriously.
Wow.
People like Charlotte Fowler Wells and her family.
Okay.
They toured all over spreading these ideas.
Really?
Yeah, and they made these charts and diagrams, trying to make it seem, scientific.
It's just amazing how people can get swayed by something if it's presented in a official way.
It's all about presentation, right?
Right, yeah, even if it's totally wrong.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just phrenology though, right?
No, not at all. Even Carl Linnaeus, the guy who came up with our system for classifying plants and animals.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the father of taxonomy.
He applied his ideas to humans, too.
Really?
In a way that just reinforced these racial hierarchies.
So even he was caught up in this.
Yeah, it was a very pervasive mindset.
Wow.
And then, of course, you've got Darwin.
Oh, yeah.
And the theory of evolution.
Right, survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
That's where that whole idea of social Darwinism comes in.
Exactly. Darwin himself never meant for his ideas to be used to justify social inequality.
Okay.
But a guy named Herbert Spencer, a social theorist.
Okay.
At the time, he took those ideas and kind of twisted them.
Oh, so he used those ideas.
Yeah, to argue that certain races, mainly Europeans, were naturally superior.
Oh, so it's basically using science to back up the power structure.
Exactly. It was a way to legitimize what was already happening.
Wow.
And this kind of thinking paves the way for even more disturbing ideas like eugenics.
Eugenics, right? The idea of controlling breeding.
Yeah, like you could improve humanity through selective breeding.
Mm-hmm.
It led to forced sterilizations and all sorts of horrific policies.
And it's scary to think that those ideas can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
So we need to be very careful how we use science.
Right. Especially when it comes to things like social hierarchies.
Yeah, absolutely.
So against this backdrop of scientific racism, European powers were also industrializing like crazy.
Okay.
And that created this huge demand for resources.
Oh, so they needed more stuff to fuel their industries.
Yeah, and new markets to sell their goods.
Okay, so you've got the ideological justification and then the economic motivation.
Yeah, they needed both.
Working together.
Exactly. And they also had the technology to make it happen.
Right.
Steamboats, to navigate the oceans.
Yeah.
Railroads to move stuff quickly.
Yeah.
And of course, more and more powerful weapons.
It's like all these things came together at once.
Yeah, a perfect storm.
To enable this expansion.
And that storm really hit Africa hard. The scramble for Africa. It was this crazy period of competition.
Between the different European powers.
Yeah, all trying to carve up the continent.
Didn't they have that Berlin conference to try and set some rules?
They did in 1884.
Okay.
But the crazy thing is not a single African representative was there.
Oh, wow.
They just decided how to divide up Africa without even asking.
It's unbelievable.
It's pretty messed up, right?
Yeah, the audacity.
They came up with this idea of effective occupation.
Effective occupation.
It basically meant a European power could claim a territory if they could show they were in control.
Okay.
Like they had to show they were bringing civilization.
Oh, so they're using that as an excuse, basically.
It was a very convenient excuse for exploitation.
Right. So it really just fueled this competition even more.
Exactly. And led to this rapid increase in European control over Africa.
I bet the situation in the Belgian Congo was a good example of this.
It's the prime example of how greed and ambition can hide behind these claims of philanthropy.
Right. So King Leopold II of Belgium.
Yeah.
He basically took the Congo as his own personal property, didn't he?
He did. It was called the Congo Free State, but it wasn't free for the people living there.
Not at all. So what were they exploiting there?
At first, it was ivory.
Okay.
They were killing off huge numbers of elephants.
So environmental destruction right from the get-go.
Pretty much.
And then after the ivory, they switched to rubber, right?
Exactly.
Is that where the connection to car tires comes in?
You got it.
Okay.
When John Boyd Dunlop invented the pneumatic tire, that created a huge demand for rubber.
And the Congo had it.
A lot of it came from there.
Yeah.
And to get as much rubber as possible, they forced people to work.
Oh, wow.
They were basically slaves.
Yeah.
If they didn't meet their quotas, they faced terrible punishments.
Like what kinds of punishments?
They'd cut off their hands and feet.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
It was meant to scare the other workers.
That's just barbaric.
It was a brutal system.
So how did this ever stop?
Well, a journalist named Edmund Morel started investigating and reporting on the atrocities.
So the truth eventually came out.
Yes. Morel's reporting really helped expose what was happening.
Wow, so one person can really make a difference.
Yeah, the power of journalism, right?
Right. And, while this was all going on, it's important to remember that people in Africa weren't just passive victims.
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
They resisted, too.
There were individuals and whole movements that fought back against colonial rule.
Like who?
Well, one of the most inspiring examples is Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia and Empress Taitu Betul.
Okay.
They led their army to victory against Italy.
Whoa, they actually defeated a European power.
They did at the Battle of Adwa in 1896.
Wow.
It was a huge symbolic victory for resistance all over Africa.
Really?
It showed that European dominance wasn't inevitable.
Right. Okay, so were there other examples of resistance?
Many, but one that comes to mind is Samori Toure in West Africa.
Okay.
He created this whole empire called the Wasulu Empire.
Wow.
And he resisted French expansion for years.
How did you do that?
He was a brilliant military strategist.
Okay.
He even used a scorched earth tactic to make sure the French couldn't get any resources.
Wow. I can't imagine the courage it took to stand up to France.
He was a true symbol of resistance.
And were there others?
Yeah. Kinjekitile Weil, also known as Bokero in Tanganyika, led the Maji Maji Rebellion.
The Maji Maji Rebellion. Yeah, I remember reading about that.
Yeah.
I think that involves some spiritual beliefs.
Yes. Weil claimed he was possessed by a spirit.
A spirit?
That gave his followers the power to be immune to bullets.
Oh, wow.
It inspired this huge rebellion against German colonial rule.
And how did that turn out?
It ended in defeat, tragically with a lot of casualties.
But it shows how strongly people felt.
Yeah, they were willing to fight for their freedom, even though it was dangerous.
Yeah, so we've seen how European powers used ideas about science and race to justify their expansion, and we've seen how people fought back against those efforts.
Yeah, it's a really complicated story.
It is, but it's only part of the story, right? Because European imperialism wasn't just in Africa.
No, not at all. They also turned their attention to other strategically important regions.
Right.
Australia, New Zealand, the Middle East.
Right. Let's dive into those next. It's interesting as we talk about all these different areas impacted by European imperialism. It's striking how interconnected everything is, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Americas.
You're absolutely right. It's all part of the same story.
Yeah, it's not just like separate little boxes of history. It's all woven together.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about politics and economics either, right? There's this huge cultural dimension too.
Well, definitely think about the spread of languages during this time.
Oh, that's a good point.
English, French, Spanish, they became the languages of government and business and even education in so many places.
And you can still see that impact today.
Oh, huge impact.
Yeah, it's a lasting legacy.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just language either. Christianity, too, spread widely through missionaries and stuff.
So imperialism wasn't just about conquering and exploiting. It was also about this cultural exchange.
Right. But it was often a very unequal exchange.
Right, of course. So we've talked about the motives behind imperialism, the key players, the regions impacted, and those who resisted.
Yeah.
But what about the long-term consequences?
Yeah.
How did this era shape the world we live in today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The legacies of imperialism are definitely still with us.
Both good and bad, I imagine.
Both the positive and the negative, for sure.
Well, let's start with the negative then.
Okay.
Because I think that's what most people think of first.
I think one of the most obvious and enduring consequences is economic inequality.
Okay.
The exploitation of resources and labor during this time created this system of global imbalance that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, so many former colonies are still struggling economically.
Right. It's like this vicious cycle. Poverty, underdevelopment, dependence on their former colonizers.
Yeah. It seems almost impossible to break out of.
It's really tough.
And then there's the political legacies too, right?
Oh, definitely. A lot of former colonies inherited political systems that were just imposed on them.
Right, by the European powers.
Exactly. And those systems often didn't take into account the existing ethnic and religious divisions.
Which caused even more problems.
Absolutely led to tons of conflict and instability.
Like those borders they drew in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
They were just totally arbitrary.
Completely. And that's a big reason why there's so much conflict there.
And then there's that whole issue of neo-colonialism, right?
Right. Even after formal colonial rule ended, a lot of these countries remained dependent on their former colonizers.
So it's like the exploitation just continued in a different form.
Exactly. It's more subtle, but the power dynamics are still there.
Okay, so we've talked about the negatives, but surely there were some positive outcomes too.
There were some positive developments.
Okay.
But it's important to acknowledge that they often came at a high cost.
Of course. So what kinds of positives are we talking about?
Well, in some places, there were improvements in infrastructure.
Like roads and stuff?
Yeah, railroads.
Yeah.
Roads, communication systems.
And that could help with economic growth, I guess?
Right. It could facilitate trade and communication.
Makes sense. And what about things like education and healthcare?
There were some advancements in those areas, too.
But I imagine those benefits weren't shared equally.
That's right. Colonial elites and certain segments of the population often benefited more than others.
So, like with most things, it's complicated.
It's never simple.
There are both positives and negatives.
Exactly. And it's important to avoid those simplistic narratives that try to paint it as one way or the other.
Okay, so the legacies of imperialism are complex, and they're still with us today.
Definitely one of the most contentious issues is the question of reparations.
Reparations, you mean like financial compensation?
Yeah, for the harm caused during colonial rule.
But how could you even calculate that?
It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
There's the question of who should pay, who should receive, and how the money should be used.
It sounds like a debate that will continue for a long time.
I think so. Another issue that's getting more attention is the repatriation of cultural artifacts.
You mean those artifacts that were taken from colonies and are now in museums in Europe and North America?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of people believe those objects should be returned.
Right, because they belong to those countries.
They're part of their cultural heritage.
Exactly, and taking them was a form of cultural theft.
It was very damaging.
So has there been any progress on these issues, reparations and repatriation?
There have been some positive examples.
Okay.
For example, Germany has paid reparations to Holocaust survivors.
Okay.
And some museums have started returning artifacts.
But it seems like there's still a long way to go.
There's definitely a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, those are tough issues to resolve.
They're really complex. They involve legal, logistical, and emotional aspects.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they remember about the legacies of imperialism?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this wasn't just a European story.
Right. It impacted the whole world.
It had global consequences. It shaped the destinies of so many people.
We can't just look at it from a European perspective.
Exactly. And while there were some positive changes,
like technology.
Yeah, the spread of technology and infrastructure, but those benefits often came at a huge cost.
We have to acknowledge both sides of the story.
Yes, both the positive and the negative. And we also have to recognize that these legacies are still alive today.
In so many ways.
Yeah, we see them in economic inequality and political instability, and in these debates over reparations and repatriation.
It shows how much history matters.
Absolutely. It's not just a bunch of dates and names, it's a living force.
That continues to influence our world.
And it's our job to engage with that history in a thoughtful and informed way.
I completely agree. So on that note, I think it's time to move on to part 3.
We're going to explore some specific examples of how people are addressing these legacies today.
Sounds good.
We'll look at case studies from around the world and see how individuals, communities, and even whole nations are grappling with this complex inheritance.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so we're back, and we've talked a lot about, the second wave of imperialism, all those different aspects, from, the scramble for Africa to these legacies that we're still dealing with.
Absolutely.
In this last part, though, let's kind of shift gears a bit and focus on how those legacies, how are they being addressed like in the 21st century,
It's a really important question because these aren't just events in a history book.
Right.
They have real consequences for people today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's start with that economic inequality issue.
Okay.
We talked about how many former colonies, they're still struggling economically. What's being done to help them?
Well, one approach is development aid.
A lot of developed countries, they give financial assistance to developing countries.
Right, to kind of help them grow.
Exactly. The goal is to promote economic growth and reduce poverty.
But haven't there been some problems with development aid?
Yeah, there's definitely a debate about how effective it really is.
Okay.
Some people say it can create dependence and corruption, while others say it's absolutely necessary.
To break that cycle of poverty.
Exactly. It's a tough issue.
Yeah. So are there other ways to approach this problem?
Well, there's fair trade, for example.
Okay.
The idea there is to make sure that producers in developing countries get a fair price for their goods.
Okay, so they can actually make a living.
Yeah, so they can improve their lives and their communities.
And I've definitely seen more fair trade products, at the store and stuff, so we can support that.
Absolutely. As consumers, we have power.
Yeah, we can choose to buy those products.
It's about making informed choices.
Right, yeah. Okay, let's talk about the political legacies. We mentioned those artificial borders, that were imposed by European powers.
Right.
And how they've led to conflict.
A lot of conflict.
What's being done to address that?
Well, there are a lot of organizations that focus on conflict resolution and peace building.
Okay.
They work in these conflict zones, trying to mediate disputes and, build trust.
Wow. That sounds like really tough work.
It is. It's incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
But it's so important they focus on addressing those root causes of conflict.
Like what kinds of things?
Poverty, inequality, discrimination, those kinds of things.
So it's not just about stopping the fighting.
No, it's about fixing the underlying problems
that caused the fighting in the first place.
Right. And another approach is through democratic reforms.
Okay.
A lot of former colonies have transitioned to democracy.
So people have more of a say in their government?
Exactly. They have a voice.
But building a democracy from scratch, that can't be easy.
It's definitely not easy, especially when you consider their history. It takes time to build strong institutions and ensure free and fair elections.
Right, and protect human rights.
All that. It's a long process.
Okay, so what about the cultural legacies?
Okay.
You know how European culture spreads so widely.
Yeah, often replacing local traditions.
What's being done to revive those traditions?
There's this movement focused on cultural revitalization.
Okay.
Communities are working to preserve their languages, their arts, their customs.
That's great. So it's about reclaiming their heritage.
Exactly. It's about celebrating their unique identities.
And I guess education is important too, right?
Absolutely. We need to teach future generations about the history of imperialism.
Yeah. So they can learn from the past.
And understand the impact it still has today.
Right. And speaking of the past, let's go back to those issues of reparations and repatriation.
Okay.
Those are becoming more prominent.
Definitely. People are talking about them more and more.
Yeah. People want to see those injustices addressed.
It's about accountability.
So what's happening on those fronts?
Well, there has been some progress.
Okay.
For example, Germany has paid reparations to Holocaust survivors.
Okay.
And some museums have started returning artifacts.
But like we said before, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, those are really tough issues to resolve.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There are so many complexities involved.
Especially with reparations, right?
Yeah, like who's responsible? How do you even calculate the amount?
And repatriation too, right?
Yeah, there are legal and logistical challenges.
But at least the conversation is happening.
That's the important thing. People are recognizing that these issues need to be addressed.
It's a step in the right direction.
It is. It's about acknowledging the injustices of the past.
And working towards a better future.
Exactly.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into imperialism,
yeah,
I'm feeling kind of a mix of hope and caution. you know?
I understand.
Hope, because people are starting to address these legacies and trying to make things right.
People are working for a more just and equitable world.
But caution, because it's not going to be easy.
No, it's going to be a long and difficult process.
Yeah, it requires, looking at those uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, and challenging those power structures.
And listening to the voices of those who've been marginalized.
It's all about empathy and understanding.
And a commitment to justice.
Absolutely.
It's a tough journey, but it's worth it.
It is. It's the right thing to do.
So the second wave of imperialism, it might be over, but it still affects us today.
It does. Its impacts are still felt.
It's like we need to understand this era.
Yeah. Learn about its complexities.
And work together to create a better future.
A future that's more equitable and more sustainable for everyone.
Well said. Well, that's it for our deep dive into imperialism.
It's been a great conversation.
It has. Thanks for listening, everyone.